Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder when I head out for a walk and deliver an episode to you while I stroll around. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good afternoon, listeners. It is a balmy June 9th today here in cicada-filled suburban Illinois. You can hear the cicadas in the trees around me. That's what that constant buzzing is. It always reminds me of like the sound that the aliens in the Independence Day make. So that's kind of what I feel like is coming, sort of. It has been quite a couple weeks. 2 weeks ago yesterday, George Floyd was murdered by a Minneapolis police officer, and I spent the last 2 weeks really mostly listening to people of color talking about their experiences and thinking about what to say and how to say it. I've been watching the discussions on Board Game Geek and on the board games subreddit of Reddit. And I guess today is the day I'm going to talk about this stuff a bit. I encourage you to listen, even if this isn't the sort of thing you normally go to your board game media to explore. But it's important that we all talk about it. So what I'm going to talk about today a little bit is why I think white people tend to be resistant to talking about this issue, and what kinds of things we should be talking about as a board game community particularly. This is not to diminish the many other places where the systemic racism at work in the United States particularly, but around the world, but frankly mostly in the United States for the purposes of this conversation, interfere in really dramatic and significant ways in the lives of people who aren't white. That said, this is a podcast about board games and the board game community, and so as it continues, I'm going to shift more and more toward talking about that. So I wanted to start with my reaction to the various threads in r/board games where people have brought up the idea that the board game culture is racist too. And a significant part of the response to that conversation was, I don't want to talk about politics in my board gaming media. So there's a couple thoughts there, but it really leads me to the first big point that I want to make, and it's certainly possible or plausible that most of my listenership already knows this, so it's more about affirming and discussing again the ideas that we already are familiar with. But the biggest challenge, I think one of the biggest challenges to talking to white people about racism is the fact that they can't see the racism in play. And I say they, I mean we too, me too. I am white, of white descent. I pass as white. I get treated like a white guy. So it takes a lot of effort for me to see how the world treats other people, because things are set up so that I won't see that. One of the things that often happens in white culture as we talk about race is that people find it offensive to be called racist. And a lot of this goes to the problematic way that we talk about discrimination and prejudice and racism in our culture. And again here, when I say our culture, I'm mostly talking about America. My sense of this in other places is much less refined. And the problem is that racism is a system designed to keep white people in positions of power over people who are not white. This system was designed in a time when white people were kidnapping people of color from other places, mostly Africa, and bringing them here to work as slaves. But the system was maintained through laws, cultural practices, and political practices throughout the history of the United States, both in our interactions with the descendants of those kidnapped Africans who were enslaved in the United States, and in our interactions with the indigenous people who lived in North America before the white people came here. In many cases, in most cases, the creation of these laws and systems was explicit. If you ever encounter anyone saying that the Civil War was about anything other than slavery, that person is deluding themselves and or not being intellectually honest with you. A study of the history of the South shows that the thing they were trying to protect was the institution of slavery. There were other economic factors, of course, that were connected to that, but those economic factors were tied to the fact that the United States made its money and set itself up on the backs of people it had kidnapped and enslaved. These systems were put into place and maintained for a very long time and still are in some ways. If you look at, the recent protests are specifically about the way that the culture of policing in this country is abusive to people of color in a way that it is not to white people. So when I talk about racism, I'm not talking about an individual prejudice, although we are all built to have that individual prejudice, and it is the work of a lifetime to undermine or erase it for ourselves and our children. The system itself has those prejudices built in as well. And this is where it's really helpful to think of the phrase anti-racist. That when people talk about racism, white people particularly, we tend to talk about it as a character trait. A person is or is not racist. And generally, we use the cartoon movie version of racist to describe someone who's racist. Someone who's racist is someone who uses the N-word, who actively talks about people of color as though they are not equal to whites. The problem with that approach is that then, by maintaining civility and maintaining a proper attitude about people of color, I can then tell myself I'm not racist, while still benefiting from the systems of power that were put in place to keep me in control. And I think one of the fundamental disconnects that we see among white people trying to talk about this is that we don't see those systems of power because they benefit us. I'm going to offer here a very trite and silly example of this kind of system, but it reminded me of these other deeper systems that it's hard for white people to see. When the COVID quarantine first started happening, there were all sorts of conversations in the board game community about how some of the online services like Board Game Arena were getting totally swamped with users. And I heard people talking about how they couldn't even get onto Board Game Arena. They would click on it and then it would just hang, and they would never get to their games. And I thought this was strange because Board Game Arena was running a little slow for me, but it worked just fine. I never had a time when I couldn't get to my games. I was always able to log in, I'd click a thing, maybe it would take a second or two longer than usual, but then I'd get to my game and I'd get to play my game. Now, sometime later, I learned that Board Game Arena had, in order to keep its paying members happy, prioritized premium memberships. So if you had a premium membership, which I did because I believed in supporting the website, so I had 2 years ago, I signed up for a premium membership, then you got bumped to the front of the line whenever you tried to log in. So the reason I wasn't experiencing delays is that I had the privilege of being a member. Now, obviously, this is different than how racist systems allow me to cut to the front of the line. But the point that really hit it home for me in terms of racist systems was I didn't see it happening. I didn't realize I was cutting to the head of the line. I just did, because that's what happens. And the problem with the way most white people talk about racism is that we don't acknowledge that it's systems that create this interplay that gives us a cut to the front of the line. It's just, we use the word racism to talk not about these systems, but rather instead to talk about, do I say the N-word? Or do I think black people are nice? And I think that one of the reasons that white people are often so hesitant to talk about racism, even if they understand intellectually the injustice of it, is that it doesn't feel good to be told you got to cheat. And for many people, including myself, it feels like a hypocrisy if I think I've achieved something and it turns out, well, part of the reason I achieved it is the system was set up for me to win. That doesn't feel good. And people don't like to do things that don't feel good. Now, none of this excuses the hard work that I think we white people need to do in order to start addressing this. Part of me making this episode today is my service toward that work, whatever small contribution it is. And part of your work, if you're a white person, is listening to this conversation and perhaps agreeing with me or disagreeing with me, but thinking about it nonetheless. So I thank you for doing that. If you're a person of color, I apologize. This is a boring episode, like me explaining the rules of Ticket to Ride to the whole group. You already know these answers. Nonetheless. So there are 4 things that I think the board game community should be working on to advance the general cause of diversity, equity, and inclusion, as the academic jargon for the current state of things goes, of the board game community. So the first of these has to be privilege. So the concept of privilege gets bandied about a lot. We've come across this phrase, check your privilege. Don't know if you've heard that one. The phrase white privilege gets people's hackles up again for the reasons I was just saying. But the idea of privilege is that you, particularly the notion of unearned privilege, is that you have a thing that you get to do that other people don't get to do. And you get to do it based on who you are, not what you did. Right? So if you're white and you get to drive around and not be pulled over by the cops very often, I can count on one hand the number of times in my life I've been pulled over by police. That is a privilege. It's not one you earned. It is part of living in a society that's built around that sort of interchange. And frankly, one that doesn't undermine police officers who enforce that privilege. So in the board game community, the place where I see this, the biggest demonstration of privilege is in the idea that we shouldn't have to talk about this. Anytime somebody brings up the way that the board game community makes them feel, or the way that the board game community excludes people or represents people, there is a significant body of people who say, I don't want to talk about that. Get out of here with that. In fact, to a degree, all of Board Game Geek works that way because there is a politics, sex, and religion, or religion, sex, and politics forum. And if your thread veers too far away from board games and too close to religion, sex, or politics, it is locked because you aren't in that no-holds-barred forum. And I'm not saying every conversation needs to be about things of political and social import, but I don't want to have to talk about that idea is an expression of privilege. It's an expression of it doesn't really bother me, so I don't want to have to talk about that. And the problem is, if you hold anti-racist views, you believe that our society should be equal, it is morally incumbent upon you to share in that emotional work of that examination. It is our job to make sure that we are pulling our weight in doing these examinations, and we cannot just leave it to the people who are bothered by exclusion, or the people who feel bad about a particular thing because they're being treated differently, to be the ones who bring it up. And particularly, we can't flex our privilege by saying, I don't feel like talking about that. I don't feel like talking about that is the sort of thing you say when it doesn't really bother you to begin with. So that is the problem of privilege in board gaming, and I think something we need to think about. The second one is inclusion. Again, this one goes to the challenge of thinking about how inclusion works in board games for white people, is that we feel like we are inclusive. One of the phrases that gets used a lot by people of color about how they experience spaces that are primarily dominated by white people is the phrase microaggression. A microaggression is a sort of casual slight or casual behavior change exhibited toward a person of color, well, toward anyone really, but in this context, a person of color, that is not equally demonstrated toward white people. So the idea that people might, the old stereotype from the 80s that somebody might get nervous if a black person is walking behind them and not nervous if a white person is walking behind them is a kind of stereotypical microaggression. But often they are very subtle, draining experiences that nonetheless make spaces uninclusive. I would say the place to start as a white person is just to be hyper aware of how you're behaving in public spaces. Be thinking about being actively welcoming, and think about how it feels to be somebody who is not like the majority. Right? We've had this conversation a number of times in board gaming about women. That there's a stereotype, and I'm afraid it is probably true, that many board gaming spaces are not very inclusive or welcoming to women because of the way men behave. That, for instance, a woman who sits down to play a complex strategy game, men might be inclined to over-explain that game to her, or suggest moves to her, or treat her as though she isn't immediately as capable at the table as a male stranger who sits down. Again, the difficulty a lot of white people, or in the case of feminism, men, have in talking about this is we don't know we're doing it. And it feels bad to be told we're doing something bad. So we push back and we say we don't do that, or you're overreacting, or there's all these defensive maneuvers that white people use when told about this behavior, rather than admitting, oh my, I didn't realize I did that, I will endeavor to do better. But I think we can endeavor to do better, and one of the main ways is to listen to voices of people of color, which is ironic because this is a white person telling you all this, but this is my channel and I recorded alone, so I did not decide to artificially ask a person of color to record here. That would have felt performative in a different way, but thinking about that. So the two other things that I think board gaming should do to be a better agent for change, and I think I'm going to strive to do, is talking about history and representation. Now, I'd say these are actually the things we've been doing already. I've certainly done that some here on this channel. That with regard to representation, this is an ongoing conversation, most often about women, but often also about people of color, asking the question of, why do the people in the game look the way they do? I remember having this conversation a lot with the students in the game culture class back when I used to teach a video game culture class, because there was a active discussion about whether game designers had an obligation to have variety in the voices they chose, in the representation they chose. And the answer usually was, no, I don't. I should just get to make the game I want, and people who want to play it can play it, and people who don't want to play it don't have to. But to me, that's abdicating the responsibility of the creative person. That the creative person's job is to think about audience, it's to think about inclusivity, it's to think about who they want to be. And certainly at the end of the day, I would never argue that the government should regulate representation in art. I think that's the wrong approach. But a lot of gamers, and you see this again, more in video games than in board games, but it's also in board games when you see pushback against this conversation. A lot of gamers don't like the idea that the audience might call them out. There is an idea that not only should they be able to make the game they want, but nobody should be able to talk about the game they made or the choices they're making. They want freedom of expression for their own creative work, but they want to clamp down on freedom of expression for the audience in reacting to that work. And that's just not how it works. I think that the landscape, conservative people will often call this PC culture, the idea of that you have to think about how other people feel. I'm being sarcastic and imagining their voice here, but the idea that you have to think about how other people feel in order to make them feel okay, so they don't feel bad about things. And the thing is, that kind of rejection of the voice of the audience is almost always white dudes reacting to people of color or women who are upset at the representation in the game. Right? It's about, well, they should get to do what they want, but they're invariably the one who is being represented, complaining that the people who aren't represented are complaining. So again, a big part of the conversation about representation needs to be the understanding that people get to complain and that you aren't sheltered from the effect that your choice has on the audience. And I think, again, the luxury of not talking about this cannot be the reason we don't talk about it, so that some people don't have to talk about it. And then finally, history. This has obviously been a big part of the podcast, the way I talk about it. As games represent history, thinking about how that history reflects what happened to real people needs to be part of the conversation. And I really wish that more European game developers would actively do that, because there are all sorts of ways you could make a game that doesn't actively reflect real human interactions that have historical consequences. And when you make a game that does reflect those real human interactions and the historical consequences that spring from them, it is bothersome to me that if you don't do that well, or in a way that I think respects the people whose lives you are representing. So what can we do about this? Obviously, the first thing I decided to do was talk about it. There are a lot of people out there going out and protesting. I think that's an important thing to do as well. Or if you can donate money to help the groups who are doing the protesting, that's a good way to make your voice heard. Yeah, I think we have an opportunity here as a culture to really reflect on what it is that we value. We have a lot of things that we say we value, but in practice we haven't demonstrated those values in some time, as far as I'm concerned. I think it's incumbent on all of us to really think about how the communities we're in, be they civic, educational, religious, or entertainment, reflect and amplify those values that we find important. And when they don't, it's important that we speak about it. Because while it's nice to not talk about this stuff all the time, it's also a privilege usually accorded to people who aren't being affected negatively by these things. So, thank you for listening today. I appreciate your letting me take some time to talk about these issues and think about how board gaming intersects with them. I hope that this has been enlightening or interesting for you. I look forward to hearing your comments over in the Board Game Geek forum, 3269, Guild 3269. Or you can reach out to me at Wombat929 or Brendan at Rattlebox Games if you so desire. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.